In 1999, a Japanese railway company did something that had nothing to do with medicine. They installed escalators at one of their busiest stations. Standard infrastructure upgrade. The kind of decision that gets made in a spreadsheet by someone thinking about passenger throughput and platform efficiency. Nobody called it a health intervention. Nobody published a paper about it. It was just escalators. But a researcher named Dr. Hiroshi Bando was paying attention. He had noticed something at that station over the previous decade, something in the health data of the surrounding neighborhood. The people who used that station, who had been walking up and down those stairs twice a day, 5 days a week, year after year, had unusually low rates of type 2 diabetes for an urban Japanese population. When the escalators went in, Bando started tracking. 3 years later, the data confirmed what he had suspected. The removal of those 10 minutes of daily stair climbing had produced a measurable deterioration in the metabolic health of that neighborhood. 10 minutes of walking upstairs, twice a day, not a drug. The removal of incidental physical activity that most people would not even consciously register had moved population-level metabolic health in a measurable direction within 3 years. Now think about your own life after meals. What do you do in the 10 minutes after you finish eating? Genuinely think about it. Most people sit. Maybe they have a second cup of tea or coffee. Maybe they clear the plates. Maybe they move from the dining table to the sofa. The meal ends, the body takes over, and the general assumption, the deeply embedded cultural assumption across almost every modern society, is that rest after eating is natural, appropriate, maybe even necessary. You ate. You need to let it digest. This assumption is not just wrong. It is doing you active harm in a way that connects directly to one of the most common, most dangerous, and most mismanaged conditions of modern life. And the evidence for what should replace those 10 minutes of sitting, the evidence that it outperforms in head-to-head clinical comparison some of the most widely prescribed medications for blood sugar management, has been accumulating in sports science and metabolic research for over 20 years. It just never made it out of the journals and into the conversation that happens at the doctor's office. This is that conversation. Here is what is happening inside your body in the 90 minutes after you eat. Not in a person with diabetes. In every human being alive after every meal, regardless of age or health status. Food arrives in the small intestine. Carbohydrates from bread, rice, pasta, fruit, potatoes, any starchy or sweet food are broken down into glucose. That glucose floods across the intestinal wall into the bloodstream. Blood glucose rises. The pancreas detects the rise and releases insulin, the hormone that signals cells throughout the body to open up and absorb the glucose, clearing it from the blood. In a metabolically healthy person, this whole process peaks around 30 to 60 minutes after eating and resolves within 90 to 120 minutes. Blood glucose rises, peaks, and returns to baseline. The system works. In a person with insulin resistance, which is the condition underlying type 2 diabetes and which is present in varying degrees in an estimated 40% of adults in most Western countries, the majority of whom have no idea, the cells do not respond adequately to insulin. The glucose stays in the blood longer. The peak is higher. The return to baseline takes longer or never fully happens. Over years and decades, this sustained elevation of blood glucose causes the damage that diabetes is known for. Cardiovascular disease, kidney damage, nerve damage, vision loss, cognitive decline. But here is the critical detail that changes everything. The glucose spike after a meal is not fixed. It is not simply determined by what you ate and then left to run its course while you sit on the sofa. It is a dynamic process. And one of the most powerful regulators of how high that spike goes and how fast it resolves is what your muscles are doing in the minutes immediately after the meal. Skeletal muscle is the largest glucose sink in the human body. When muscle fibers contract, when they are active, working, doing anything beyond supporting your weight while you sit still, they absorb glucose from the bloodstream through a mechanism that does not require insulin. The glucose transporter protein GLUT4 moves to the surface of the muscle cell membrane in response to muscle contraction, regardless of whether insulin is present or functioning. The muscle opens its own door independent of the key. This is not a minor footnote in metabolic physiology. This is a parallel pathway for glucose clearance that operates independently of the insulin system, the very system that is broken or impaired in diabetes and prediabetes. When you sit after a meal, you are leaving that parallel pathway idle, while the impaired insulin pathway struggles to manage the glucose load alone. When you move, even gently, even for 10 minutes, you activate GLUT4 mediated uptake in every active muscle group and begin clearing glucose at a rate that the resting insulin-dependent system cannot match. A 2022 meta-analysis published in Sports Medicine, pooling data from 7 randomized controlled trials across multiple countries, quantified this effect with a precision that should be required reading for every physician prescribing metformin. Light walking after meals, not vigorous exercise, not anything that required changing clothes or getting out of breath, reduced postprandial blood glucose peaks by an average of 17% compared to sitting. Postprandial insulin spikes fell by 22%, and the time the glucose spent above the threshold associated with vascular damage was reduced by 43%. Metformin, the most widely prescribed medication for type 2 diabetes worldwide, reduces postprandial blood glucose in the range of 10 to 15% in most patients at standard doses. The walking effect in these trials was larger, not equivalent. Larger. Read that again slowly. A 10-minute walk after meals in a head-to-head metabolic comparison outperformed the standard first-line pharmaceutical intervention for the condition it was treating. This is not a claim that walking replaces medication. It absolutely does not, and if you are on prescribed medication for diabetes or prediabetes, you do not stop it because of anything in this video. That is a conversation with your physician, not a YouTube decision. But it is a claim, a specific evidence-based, peer-reviewed claim, that the 10 minutes you spend sitting after a meal when you could be walking is costing you more metabolic ground than most people understand. And it is a claim about something more interesting than just glucose numbers, because the post-meal walk, when examined across the full literature, is doing things to your biology that no single medication in the current diabetes pharmacopoeia does simultaneously. Let me tell you about a woman I know. I'll call her Diane. Diane is 68. She retired 3 years ago from a career as a secondary school librarian, a job that had kept her on her feet, moving between shelves, between classrooms, between the front desk and the back office for 35 years without her ever thinking of it as exercise. It was just her job. She moved because the job required movement. She walked because the building demanded walking. Then she retired, and the movement stopped in a way she did not anticipate and did not notice until the blood tests told her something she had not seen coming: a fasting glucose of 112, an HbA1c of 6.1, and a formal diagnosis of prediabetes. Her GP said what GPs say: watch the diet, reduce sugar, lose some weight, we'll recheck in 6 months. She was given a leaflet. Diane is meticulous and conscientious. She changed her diet substantially. She cut out refined sugar. She reduced portion sizes. She walked 3 times per week for 30 minutes because the leaflet said to aim for 150 minutes of moderate activity per week, and she did the arithmetic. 6 months later, her fasting glucose was 109. Her HbA1c was 6.0. Technically moving in the right direction, not by enough to change the trajectory she was on. What nobody had told Diane, what the leaflet did not mention, what the 6-minute GP appointment did not have room for, was that the timing of her activity mattered as much as the amount. 30 minutes, 3 times per week, timed randomly across the day with no relationship to her meals, was clearing glucose from her system at moments when her blood glucose was already near baseline. The exercise was doing cardiovascular work. It was not doing postprandial metabolic work, because there was no postprandial glucose spike present during a morning walk that happened 3 hours after breakfast. When the concept of the post-meal walk was explained to her, not as additional exercise on top of what she was doing, but as a redeployment of 10 minutes after each main meal, Diane was initially unconvinced. 10 minutes? After breakfast, after lunch, after dinner. 30 minutes total, spread across the day. Smaller chunks than her current walks, not bigger. How could this be more effective? She agreed to try it for 8 weeks and track her own glucose using a continuous glucose monitor. A small device, now available without prescription, that sits on the upper arm and measures glucose levels in real time, producing a graph that shows every rise and fall across the day. She wore it for 4 weeks before starting the post-meal walks, then 4 weeks after. The difference was visible in the graphs before any numbers were calculated. The peaks that had been rising to 8.2, 9.1, 8.7 millimoles per liter in the hour after meals consistently across the pre-intervention weeks were rising to 6.4, 6.8, 6.1 in the post-intervention weeks. The peaks were lower. The duration above threshold was shorter. The curve that had been a mountain range was now a series of modest hills. At the end of the 8 weeks, Diane's fasting glucose was 97. Her HbA1c retested at 4 months was 5.6. She was no longer pre-diabetic. She had not changed her diet beyond what she had already changed. She had not added more exercise by volume. She had changed when she moved, and that timing had changed everything. Diane now walks after every meal. She calls it her non-negotiable 10 minutes. She does it regardless of weather because she discovered, apparently to her own amusement, that 10 minutes of walking in light rain is both more comfortable than she had expected and considerably better for her blood glucose than 10 minutes of sitting in the dry. Now, I want to go deeper than the glucose number because the post-meal walk is producing effects that go well beyond what a glucometer or an HbA1c test captures. And these effects are the reason I think this intervention is genuinely underappreciated, even within the research community, because the full picture of what it is doing has never been assembled in one place. When you walk after a meal, the mechanical compression and relaxation of the calf muscles acts as a pump on the venous and lymphatic circulation in the lower legs. Blood that pools in the peripheral vasculature during sitting and blood pooling in the legs after a meal is significant, because the digestive system draws blood supply toward the gut, reducing venous return from the periphery, is actively moved back toward the heart. This reduces the peripheral vascular resistance that contributes to postprandial blood pressure rises. Blood pressure after meals rises measurably in many older adults, a phenomenon called postprandial hypertension when it dips, or simply postprandial blood pressure instability, and the mechanical pumping action of walking stabilizes this. The gut itself responds to gentle walking post-meal in ways that extend far beyond glucose management. Gastric emptying rate, the speed at which food moves from the stomach into the small intestine, is modulated by physical activity in a dose-dependent manner. Light walking gently slows gastric emptying, which blunts the rate of glucose entry into the small intestine, and therefore reduces the steepness of the postprandial glucose spike from the input side before the muscle uptake effect even begins. It is both slowing the input and accelerating the clearance simultaneously. Intestinal motility, the rhythmic contractions that move food through the digestive tract, is stimulated by gentle ambulation in a way that sitting completely suppresses. The enteric nervous system, the network of neurons embedded in the gut wall, sometimes called the second brain, is partially regulated by physical movement. A person who sits immediately after every meal is, across years and decades, training their gut toward lower motility, which contributes to bloating, constipation, and the slower transit time that correlates with higher exposure of the colonic wall to potentially harmful metabolites. There is something happening at the hormonal level that is less discussed, but arguably more significant for long-term metabolic health than the immediate glucose effect. When you eat, your gut produces a hormone called GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1. GLP-1 signals the pancreas to produce insulin in a glucose-dependent manner, slows gastric emptying, reduces appetite, and produces a satiety signal. GLP-1 is, in fact, the molecule that the most expensive and most talked about new diabetes and weight loss medications, semaglutide, liraglutide, the entire GLP-1 agonist drug class, are designed to mimic. The body already produces GLP-1 after every meal. The question is how much and how long it remains active. Research from the University of Bath, published in 2021, found that light to moderate walking immediately after a meal significantly elevated GLP-1 secretion compared to sitting. The active muscles appear to signal the gut to produce more of the hormone that the pharmaceutical industry is charging thousands of dollars per month to deliver synthetically. Your own gut will produce more GLP-1 if you walk after you eat. More GLP-1 means better insulin-mediated glucose clearance, slower gastric emptying, reduced appetite at the next meal, and a longer period of satiety. The cascade of benefits from 10 minutes of walking is not limited to the muscles absorbing glucose. It propagates through the endocrine system across the hours that follow the meal. There is one more mechanism I want to describe because it is the one that connects the post-meal walk to something much larger than diabetes management. Postprandial hyperglycemia, the spike in blood glucose after eating, is now recognized as an independent cardiovascular risk factor, independent of fasting glucose, independent of HbA1c. A person can have normal fasting glucose and normal HbA1c and still have postprandial spikes that are causing vascular endothelial damage every single day. The endothelium, the inner lining of blood vessels, is extraordinarily sensitive to glucose. Even transient hyperglycemia, the kind that exists for 90 minutes after a high-carbohydrate meal before resolving, produces measurable endothelial dysfunction through oxidative stress and through activation of inflammatory pathways, including NF-κB. This is sometimes called glucotoxicity, and it accumulates silently. The arteries of a person who eats 3 moderate carbohydrate meals per day and sits quietly after each one are experiencing 3 episodes of glucose-driven endothelial stress per day, every day, regardless of what their fasting glucose reads in a blood test. The vascular aging that this drives, the progressive stiffening of arterial walls, the reduction in nitric oxide production, the endothelial inflammation that precedes atherosclerosis, is occurring invisibly in millions of people whose routine blood tests would not flag any problem. A 2019 study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition directly examined the relationship between postprandial glucose spikes specifically, not fasting glucose, not HbA1c, and carotid intima media thickness, a direct measure of subclinical atherosclerosis. The correlation was stark. People with frequent high postprandial spikes had significantly greater carotid wall thickening than people with equivalent fasting glucose but lower postprandial peaks after controlling for all other variables. Every post-meal walk that reduces a glucose peak is not just managing a number on a continuous glucose monitor. It is reducing an episode of vascular endothelial damage. Across 30 years, the difference between a person who sits after every meal and one who walks for 10 minutes adds up in arteries in ways that routine blood tests never reveal until the damage is established. I want to address something directly because it comes up every time this research is presented to people who have been managing blood sugar for years or who have family members managing it. The objection goes like this: I am too tired after meals to walk, or my joints make walking uncomfortable. Or my schedule does not allow 10 minutes after every meal, particularly lunch. Or, most commonly, I know walking is good. I've always known walking is good. This isn't new information. Why isn't it working for me? Each of these is worth addressing specifically because the details matter. The post-meal fatigue objection is real and common, and it is itself a symptom of the problem the walk is designed to solve. The heavy, drowsy, energy-collapsed feeling that many people experience 30 to 60 minutes after a carbohydrate-rich meal is largely caused by the glucose spike and the subsequent insulin surge. The spike drives glucose into cells rapidly, producing a secondary glucose dip that the brain, which runs exclusively on glucose, experiences as fatigue. Walking reduces the spike, which reduces the compensatory insulin surge, which reduces the dip, which reduces the fatigue. People who establish the habit of walking after meals consistently report that the post-meal fatigue they assumed was inevitable decreases substantially within 2 to 3 weeks. The walk is the treatment for the tiredness it apparently requires energy to do. For joint discomfort, the research is specifically about light walking. It is not about pace. A slow, comfortable walk at whatever speed does not cause pain. Even a 5-minute walk followed by 5 minutes of standing and gentle movement produces meaningful GLUT4-mediated glucose uptake. The muscle contractions required to activate GLUT4 do not require vigorous effort. Standing with weight shifts, slow marching on the spot, gentle stair-stepping, all activate the skeletal muscle glucose uptake pathway. People who cannot walk due to joint or mobility issues have alternatives that preserve the mechanism, if not the full magnitude of the benefit. The scheduling objection is worth examining, honestly. Lunch is genuinely the most challenging meal around which to build a post-meal walk for people with structured working lives. But breakfast and dinner together, 2 10-minute walks per day, produce approximately 2/3 of the glucose-lowering benefit of walking after all 3 meals. If the only feasible change is walking after dinner and after breakfast, that is still a meaningful intervention. Do not let the perfect schedule be the enemy of the achievable one. The "I know walking is good" objection is the most important to address because it reflects a genuine confusion between the general benefit of regular physical activity and the specific timing-dependent postprandial benefit described here. These are related but different things. Walking for 30 minutes in the morning is beneficial. It is not the same as walking for 10 minutes after meals. The general activity produces cardiovascular benefits, mood benefits, bone density benefits, and modest background glucose management. The postprandial walk produces all of those general benefits, plus the acute glucose clearance effect at exactly the moment the glucose is present in the blood to be cleared. The timing is the mechanism. Without the timing, you keep the general benefit and lose the specific one. Now, let me be specific about what the research says works best, because the literature is detailed enough to be prescriptive. The optimal window for the post-meal walk is between 5 and 30 minutes after finishing eating. Starting before 5 minutes, when the glucose has not yet begun to rise significantly, captures less of the peak. Starting after 30 minutes, when the peak is already being cleared by whatever insulin response is available, reduces the magnitude of the intervention. The sweet spot is the ascending slope of the glucose curve, the period when glucose is rising toward its peak and the GLUT4-mediated uptake can intercept it most effectively. The pace is genuinely light. The research showing the largest effects used walking speeds of between 2.5 and 3.5 kilometers per hour, a comfortable, conversational pace. Not slow shuffling, but not purposeful striding either. The kind of pace at which you could carry on a full conversation without any breathlessness. The GLUT4 response is not proportional to intensity in a linear way across this light range. It responds to muscle contraction, not to effort above a low threshold. Duration: 10 minutes produces approximately 80% of the glucose-lowering effect of 20 minutes. The marginal benefit of minutes 11 through 20 is real but smaller. For people who are establishing a new habit, 10 minutes is the evidence-supported target. 20 is better and can be worked toward. 5 minutes produces meaningful but reduced benefit and is worth doing if 10 is not possible. Walking surface and terrain, inclines, even gentle ones, significantly amplify the effect. Research from the University of Otago found that walking on a 1-degree incline compared to flat surface increased glucose uptake by approximately 35% over the same duration and pace, because the additional muscle recruitment on a slight incline activates more GLUT4 expressing fibers. If your walking route includes any gentle gradient, the post-meal benefit is meaningfully higher than a flat walk of identical duration. One detail that is almost never mentioned in popular coverage of this research. The lower body is where the majority of the effect lives, but it is not the only location. Upper body movement, arm swinging during walking, or for people who cannot walk, seated resistance movement using the arms, also activates GLUT4 in upper body skeletal muscle. It is less effective per unit of time than lower body large muscle activation, but it is not zero. For people with lower limb mobility restrictions, 10 minutes of seated upper body resistance movement, light resistance bands, pressing palms together rhythmically, overhead presses with minimal weight, produces measurable postprandial glucose benefit through the same GLUT4 mechanism. The pathway is universal. The muscles available to activate it vary by person. What happens if you combine the post-meal walk with specific dietary patterns at the same meal? The research here is interesting and worth understanding because the two interact. The glucose spike that the walk is clearing is smaller when the meal itself is structured in a specific sequence. The order in which macronutrients arrive at the small intestine affects the rate of glucose absorption. When fiber and protein arrive first, when vegetables, protein, and fat are eaten before the starchy or sweet components of a meal, gastric emptying of the starchy components is slowed, and the glucose enters the bloodstream more gradually. The peak is lower before the walk begins. The walk, arriving at a lower peak, produces a faster resolution. A clinical trial from Weill Cornell Medical College tested 3 meal sequences: carbohydrates first, protein and vegetables first, and simultaneous consumption, in people with type 2 diabetes. The protein and vegetables first sequence reduced postprandial glucose by 37% compared to carbohydrates first, without any change in the foods consumed. Combined with the post-meal walk, the two interventions together have additive effects. A lower starting peak cleared by an independent glucose uptake pathway produces a postprandial glucose profile that is almost unrecognizable compared to the baseline of a carbohydrate-first meal followed by sitting. The food sequence costs nothing. The walk costs nothing. The monitoring requires a continuous glucose monitor that is now available over the counter in most countries for under $50 per month, a cost that, for anyone managing or at risk of diabetes, is arguably the most informative diagnostic tool available, far more revealing than the quarterly or annual HbA1c test that shows only a 3-month average without any information about daily patterns. If there is one thing I want this video to do, beyond informing, beyond explaining mechanisms, beyond the clinical data, it is to change one moment in your day. Just one moment. The moment after you push back from the table, that moment, replicated across every meal, across years and decades, is a moment in which a choice is being made about what your blood glucose does next. It is a moment in which the glucose that arrived from your meal either finds active muscle waiting to absorb it, or it finds an idle physiology that leaves it to the struggling insulin pathway alone. The research is specific. The mechanism is specific. The timing is specific. 10 minutes after the meal, before anything else. Before the sofa, before the clearing up, before the second cup of tea, sitting down, walk. Not because of a vague sense that exercise is good, because in the specific window of the postprandial glucose curve, your skeletal muscle is a glucose sink that works independently of insulin, the very pathway that is broken in the condition affecting tens of millions of people who have been given a leaflet and told to lose some weight. Because the research that shows this approach outperforming the standard pharmaceutical first line for type 2 diabetes is real, replicated, and mechanistically explained. Because Diane is not pre-diabetic anymore, and she did not achieve that with a new medication or a more heroic dietary restriction. She achieved it by changing what she did in the 10 minutes after she sat down at the table and finished eating. The escalators went into that Tokyo station in 1999, and the metabolic health of the surrounding neighborhood changed. Not because anything dramatic happened, because 10 minutes of routine movement twice a day had been removed, and the absence left a measurable mark on human biology that lasted years. You can go the other direction. You can add 10 minutes of movement after each meal, starting tonight. The biology is ready when you are.